OC World is made possible by the generous contributions of the Marisla Foundation, the Keith and Judy Swain Family Foundation, and viewers like you. Thank you. Out of sight, out of mind. The invisible hands that pick the fruits and produce we enjoy every day suffer disproportionate health impacts during COVID-19. These farm workers and their families were designated as essential workers to keep the economy going as lives perished, leaving their loved ones devastated. This documentary provides early history of agricultural workers' treatment, lack of protection from national labor laws, and reveals the power of people working in collaboration to address the need for pandemic protection among this vulnerable community of people.
We begin here, in front of this mural in the barrio of Atwood in Placentia, California. The artist, Manuel Hernandez Trujillo, who lived not far from here in the city of Santa Ana, painted his central concern on this wall, and that was to not allow us to forget our history and the enduring contributions to the agricultural produce of this nation. This historical mural also conveys a common memory, captured in the central image of a field with furrows extending and reaching into infinity, reflecting the decade upon decade of farm workers' back-breaking labor. Today, California produces more than a third of the entire country's vegetables and at least 2/3 of the country's fruits and nuts, accounting for more than 13% of the nation's total agricultural value. And yet, the average American has little idea of how food reaches our tables. And we rarely think about the farm workers and their families and the sacrifices they continue to make for the nation. During the middle of an historic COVID-19 pandemic, harvesting season 2020 left vulnerable a largely Mexican workforce who picked and processed crops to distribute throughout the state and nation. In the beginning, at the epicenter of the health crisis in California, there was a lack of resources and assistance, as reported by those who were on the front lines. These designated essential workers remained invisible and vulnerable. In fact, they faced some of the highest infection rates in the state as they continued to risk their health and well-being, working for the harvest.
From the very beginning, when we heard about this pandemic, we knew that this community of farm workers was going to be significantly impacted for a variety of reasons. First of all, it's a community that lacks access to healthcare. Number two, they live cramped into very small housing units, mobile home parks, and that cramped space doesn't allow for the physical distancing. In addition to those challenges, this is a community that cannot stop working. They could not sit down and say, I'm going to have a Zoom meeting. I cannot Zoom into a field. And you have to go and work and pick up the grapes and the dates and everything that they're doing in very, very harsh conditions. It's a community that has been, in many cases, invisible to the rest of us.
Farm workers have always done the essential work of harvesting the country's food for little reward and fewer protections or benefits. According to a 2020 UC Berkeley School of Public Health study, COVID-19 Latino cases in the United States are 5 times higher and have a higher mortality rate than non-Hispanic whites. To understand the current COVID-19 plight facing farm workers and their families, it is helpful to first look back at the recent past. For example, in 1936, in Orange County, California, once the citrus capital of the country, thousands of farm workers went on strike for higher wages and the right to unionize. These organizing efforts were quickly and brutally suppressed, and soon the strike became an unequal battle between the citrus workers and armed vigilantes who roamed the fields, assaulting anyone who thought to be connected with the strikers. The continued unjust and inhumane treatment of farm workers, and by extension their families, has a long history dating back almost 80 years to the establishment of the Bracero program, which brought Mexican labor to the United States to work the harvest of our bountiful agricultural crops.
The Bracero program began in 1942, and it lasted till 1964. The working conditions of agricultural laborers 100 years ago, going into the Bracero program and continuing to the present, have basically remained the same. They live in overcrowded conditions. The various people working in agriculture live together, and they continue to live for the harvest.
The Bracero program had the best intentions to bring immigrant workers to this country so our food supply chains could remain viable and productive. My grandfather did it for a lifetime. He harvested grapes his entire life, and it was incredibly hard work, and it was backbreaking work. And it was a program that was rife with issues. It lacked a lot of worker protections. And so a lot of these conditions, unfortunately, still exist to this day.
Well, the Bracero program demonstrated how agricultural labor had been dealt with by employers, by the corporate agricultural enterprises. These workers were perhaps one of the most highly controlled labor forces seen since slavery.
The birth of the modern-day farm labor movement came after the Bracero program ended in 1964. The United Farm Workers movement was now able to persuade growers to meet with workers in negotiations, in part because of the utilization of the consumer boycott. Berkeley assistant professor Christian Pais grew up in the Coachella Valley, in a community of public housing in the small town of Termal, where most of his friends were from farm-working families.
And this is the real magic of the United Farm Worker Movement, that it is able to convince people in New York and in Chicago and in Miami and so forth to support them by boycotting grapes. And we usually tell the story as a narrative, in a narrative that is quite triumphant, that the farm worker wins. Right? But it wins in 1970, and very few people would argue that 1970 was an incredibly progressive time period for this country. It only gets worse.
During the last 2 decades, as California agriculture continued to grow, more and more immigrants continued to arrive, exacerbating the working and living conditions of farm workers and their families. All of California agricultural regions were hit hard by the pandemic. Monterey County in Central California and the Coachella Valley in Southern California are just two examples. The Coachella Valley sits about 2-hour drive southeast of Los Angeles and 1 hour north of the California-Mexico border. 50% of the families in the eastern Coachella Valley live and work under the poverty line.
My name is Eduardo Jaime. So my family is from Mexico, from Jalisco. That's where I was born too. My family tested out positive about maybe like 2 or 3 months ago, and I wasn't really affected by it, but my mom was, because she's family oriented, so she's used to having people around. And since we were tested out positive, like no one would visit us and no one would anything, and she kind of felt depressed. Most than anything is just like moral support from the relatives and whatnot that say that, oh, like in Spanish, pues échale ganas, I mean, we can get through this. So my dad was the one that actually got more severe than like the rest of us. He was the last one to get sick, but also the one that was more severe. And I mean, he tried calling like the clinics and anything. He told them, was there like anything that you can do to like feel better or something? And they're like, well, not really. Like there's no cure for it, so we can't really do much. People were like, oh, you're not gonna go back. You're not gonna finish. We already know it. When you take a gap year, it's a for sure thing. You start getting money and you don't want to go back. Even though times are tough right now with the whole pandemic and everything, like, I mean, we still need the money, and well, school doesn't stop, so we gotta do both.
Monterey County conditions were similar to the Coachella Valley. The county is recognized as the salad bowl of the world, with first-class support systems, making this Central Coast California region ideal for growing vegetables, wine grapes, strawberries, and flowers. The California Salinas Valley is home to more than 50,000 farm workers, many of whom are Mexican immigrants and undocumented. Low wages and food insecurity made many fearful of missing work when they were sick, and fear of deportation may have also deterred them from seeking health care. Dr. Max Cuevas is director of Clínica del Valle de Salinas in Monterey County and was instrumental in the collaborative efforts between growers and farm workers.
It's not uncommon for one house to have 3, 4, 5, as many as 6 families all living together. Part of a response to the economics of housing in Monterey County, it's super expensive. And a farm worker with a farm worker salary is not going to be able to afford the rent or the mortgage on a house. So people have partnered up to live together. So that piling up of people makes it perfect for this virus to spread quickly and infect a lot of people.
Chris Valdez is president of the Growers Shipper Association, a trade group that represents agricultural employers in Monterey County.
We've identified the agricultural industry as an essential sector, which, you know, when you break it all down, meant that you were required or expected or asked to continue to work throughout the challenges of the pandemic. There was never a day off. There was never an option, particularly for these folks and what they do, because they are harvesting and producing. They are the backbone of the agricultural sector that here in this region is largely responsible for a majority of the nation's vegetables and some of the nation's fruits.
And it's ironic that we have farm workers that are laboring in the fields, doing back-breaking work, bringing the freshest produce to market, that have endured disproportionate impacts because of COVID-19 and the work that they do. These same workers and their families are facing higher and higher rates of food insecurity, housing insecurity. So certainly as a state, as a country, as a society, we need to do better.
It's a very tight-knit community with one local Catholic church. It had a wonderful priest, Father Valdovinos, who was working every day to bring food to the families in that community. Father Valdovinos, through his work, got infected with COVID-19. And then everybody who was working with him also got infected. Father Valdovino unfortunately passed away, And
Father Balduino's death left a deep emptiness in the heart of this community that has suffered so disproportionately from the coronavirus pandemic. After the sad news, hundreds of prisoners lined up to get their vaccination.
those are the things that we see that many other people don't get to see when we're doing this work. And I think that something that I learned through my education and that I apply today is that leadership requires walking the street and knowing the people and knowing what is happening, because that's how you can create change. That's how you can inform public policy and public programs to bring resources into these communities. That's what makes you sensitive to the needs of the people and deeply informed of what a community really needs.
Yeah, I think that workforce and that group of people remain largely invisible because I think our nation as a whole hasn't come to grips with the reality that that workforce and those sources of labor aren't supposed to exist. That is to say, they're here, the workers are here, most of them not documented, but somebody pretended that there's a policy that says undocumented people don't come here.
Beyond the invisibility and legal status issues, many farm workers also face severe language barriers, no internet access, and lack basic computer literacy. Alejandro Espinosa comments on these communication concerns.
One of our first efforts that we did was to establish a communication subcommittee within the collaborative to address some of these miscommunication myths, and a lot of this, hesitancy was derived because of that. There was a lot of myths, there's a lot of, scared folks out there about the vaccine. They really didn't have the information in their native language, so we were able to take really complex and technical terminology and disseminate information internally.
Max Ochoa, a Purépecha native, represents a new generation of local leaders who have received a university education and have returned to help their communities.
There is the language barrier, the spoken one. There's the written barrier, especially for a lot of indigenous communities where they don't necessarily have the educational background. And there's also the digital barrier, where a lot of people don't have or don't really know how to use the technology like computers in order to access it. When it comes down to farm workers, their primary language of communication is not Spanish nor English. This already puts them at a disadvantage about the information that they're getting. This puts them at a disadvantage of knowing how to ask for help and knowing where to go to, for help.
George Tudor is a third-generation family farmer in the Coachella Valley since the 1940s. His company, Tudor Ranch, was started by his grandfather, and now he and his siblings run an agricultural business that grows lemons, dates, and grapes. He recalls the initial denials and leadership failures that led to widespread confusion of what to do at the beginning of the pandemic.
Just running a business during this time where we had 700-800 employees was pretty crazy, trying to just keep up with the changing rules, especially in the very beginning last spring. Nobody really knew what was going on. The rules were changing as people were figuring out this disease. But in general, it was always face masks, distance, wash your hands.
In similar fashion to what occurred in the Coachella Valley, rapid testing and vaccinations occurred in Monterrey, also in a partnership between growers and a community health clinic. In the summer of 2020, local agricultural employers, in cooperation with a local health clinic, successfully inoculated over 10,000 farm workers through employer-based vaccine clinics. Assemblyman Rivas as chair of the state's Agricultural Committee, along with the Latino caucus, sent a letter to the governor's office conveying the need to include farm workers in the vaccine rollout. The governor responded by including farm workers in Phase 1B of the rollout, providing them with priority status.
I, had to shift and recalibrate our legislative package, to address and to try to mitigate a lot of the challenges because of the pandemic. Essentially, the legislation does two things. It funded an educational campaign educating farm workers on their rights, the benefits that they're eligible for, but also educated them on how they can protect themselves from, contracting the virus.
Unfortunately, there's a misconception that growers, farmers, don't care about their farm workers. I don't believe that's true as a farmer. Our farm workers are our most important asset, and the truth is there's not excess labor to shed aside to mistreat your employees. That's just not a reality in today's world, 2021.
Berkeley Professor Pais believes this country needs to do more to prevent another tragedy like COVID-19 impacting so horrifically farm workers and their families. He cites 4 key policy areas to improve the lives of farm workers who are essential to our food security. They are immigration reform, basic infrastructure and adequate housing, access to health care, and renewed investment in education.
There's a consistency to the fact that these farm workers have been Mexican for a very long time. Some of the people who I interviewed talk about how their grandparents and their great-grandparents were Mexican farm workers, and how their children now are some of them are no longer farm workers, but their children's peers are. This is a continuous line of Mexican labor in the United States agricultural landscape. This is not just a coincidence. And part of what I'm suggesting is that the reason why Mexicans have served as the farm working population of this country is because they represent a vulnerable population.
COVID did not create the inequities. It's not because of COVID that our farm working communities are in need. That happened before. A lot of our rural communities are struggling with access to clean water, access to sewer, access to housing. We don't have the basic infrastructure to support a thriving, healthy community. As we're preparing to recover from the pandemic, we need to realize that unless we address those systemic issues, they're going to keep determining in a very unfair way who can bounce back and who continues struggling.
When you have food that's grown in California, it didn't just get there by magic, it didn't get there by happenstance. There were dedicated workers who made sure that you got that food at the table. And they were able to personalize and are able to personalize the stories of so many who sacrifice, who come to California, who come to the United States in search of a better life, who work incredibly hard in the agricultural sector. And I would just hope that each one of us can acknowledge and understand that when we go to the grocery store, that food didn't just magically show up. Somebody had to do that hard work, do the labor necessary to get it ready so that we have this bountiful harvest that too often we take for granted.
Manuela Ramirez, Youth Services Coordinator for the Alianza Nacional de Campesinas, shares her perspective on the experiences of farm workers.
So, me considero campesina y por eso ayudo a los campesinos porque sé el trabajo que pasan, todas las injusticias que pasan, ya sea en el trabajo o en el sistema o en todas partes. Muchas veces es porque nos miran por el color o porque no hablamos el inglés o porque no tenemos un nivel de estudio más alto que ciertas personas. Sí. Por X razón nos tratan un poquito como para abajo. Ajá, nos miran para abajo, claro. Sabiendo que somos personas que estamos trayendo mucha economía al país, que le estamos ayudando mucho al país, que estamos haciendo bastante bien al país, porque no venimos a hacerle daño al país, al contrario, venimos a hacerle bien al país.
Undocumented migrants and farm workers in particular are often referred to as being socially vulnerable to different types of shocks that happen in our society. If it's a natural disaster, or if it's being exposed to pesticides or a pandemic. They're socially vulnerable because of their position in society. They're often rendered invisible from policymakers, as well as disaster relief organizations and general society because of that position in society, where they're not considered being a valuable legal member of our society.
My dream is that many of these farm workers are going to have the protection and the visibility that they need, because the pandemic demonstrated how critical it is to have a healthy, productive farm workers community in the United States. And those people, they require and they need and they deserve to be treated with utmost dignity. They need to have the legal status that many of them don't have today, and we need an immigration reform that will provide the basic protection that we can allow all the institutions in the United States to treat this community fairly, justly, with dignity.
Today, the security of our food and its supply chains are under serious challenge. From this history, we've learned many of the reasons of the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on farm workers and their families. And we have also learned of the value of cooperation among community-based organizations, health clinics, local leaders, and responsive growers. The power of the people working together in support of these essential workers. This remains a story of human dignity too long denied, and of justice too long deferred.
Immigration reform, undocumented workers, labor conditions, and health care are heavy and complex topics. It can divide people and communities at a time when more than ever we need to come together. There are no easy answers, but maybe through bold leadership we can walk down these uncomfortable paths toward imperfect solution. Until next time, from all of us at OC World, stay safe and be well.
Tu abuelo sabe luchar por la vida y el derecho, por los frutos de la tierra y el sudor de su trabajo, el sudor de su trabajo. Yo me fui como bracero, aguantando 1000 penurias para mejorar la vida, sacrifiqué a mi familia. Mira, mis pies y mis manos son muestra del sacrificio que pagamos los braceros. De lo mucho que sufrimos, de lo mucho que sufrimos. Quiero darte mi consejo, defendamos lo que es nuestro, la dignidad, el respeto, nuestro ser, nuestro derecho. Apoyado en su bastón, con paso firme y sereno, lo acompaña a la asamblea. Fui a luchar junto a mi abuelo, fui a luchar junto a mi abuelo.